Director of Climate Policy, Center on Globalization and Sustainable Development, Earth Institute, Columbia University, and Senior Advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Hello, and thank you for joining us, sir. So please tell us about the much talked about initiative called Sustainable Development Solutions Network that has been initiated over a year back.
Okay, yeah, so today is the first day of DSDS. Second day, the 7th of February, Professor Jeff Sachs is going to be announcing the launch of the South Asia's SDSN. What we are doing is at the request of the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. Professor Sachs is leading a global initiative of universities, think tanks, private business, and interested kind of governments to come together to focus on how do you resolve some of the tough challenges on sustainability.
Right.
On three dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
One is, of course, on ecological, that's the environmental dimension. How do you kind of make development less impactful on environment?
Right.
How do you kind of make it kind of more nurturing?
Right.
Then on the economic, how do you kind of have this as economically sustainable for the future?
Right.
For example, you don't burn through natural capital, and hence you can cost them right. And the third, often people forget, the third important leg of sustainability is social inclusion.
Right.
You have increasing inequities in the world,
Yeah.
not only between countries. For example, in India, we're always very conscious about between countries. There's always a race to who is doing better.
Right.
Is China or is it India,
Yeah.
or is it US or an India and so on. But we forget that even here there is a rising inequity. There is over 30% of the population is under the poverty line. So what's the nature of development, sustainable development, that needs to be considered and needs to be kind of executed. So it's on the pragmatics of development that we're having this. It's a global network of universities, think tanks that come together both regionally and nationally. For example, we've had a very impressive beginning in Southeast Asia. Across Southeast Asia, there is a network emerging.
Right.
And this again is not to suggest that there are no networks that already exist working in sustainability.
Right.
If there are such networks, we actually invite them and we kind of work with them.
Right.
This is not kind of a one-upmanship or a flagship program. This is to say we would bring in the best science, global practices, engineering, technology, company kind of know-how into solving these issues. So that's kind of really exciting, and it's outside the government system. It's outside the UN system, and it's designed to be outside, so that we just focus on the knowledge part, the knowledge domain.
Right. So would it be right to say that this is more of a bottom-up approach, where the network will be actually working with people at the bottom of the pyramid and people who, at the grassroots level, who will be able to understand the new technologies and innovations and be able to implement it right away, without having to go through the bureaucratic process of any government policy implementation as such?
Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Okay.
This is definitely the focus is really on not only the bottom of the pyramid, but the whole pyramid. Because if you have parts of the pyramid not sustainable, the pyramid doesn't exist.
Right.
So it's not really trying to go outside the existing governmental system. But we have noticed repeatedly, and I'm sure this is an observation that you also have made, that when you have intergovernmental negotiations, they get hung or they proceed on the lowest common denominator. So our focus is how to bring in science, technology, engineering back into development, rather than just pure diplomacy. Diplomacy is important, but it shouldn't be at the cost of bringing in the best science. So this is actually working with the best universities, think tanks around the world, but focusing on pragmatics of development. So it's not going to be esoteric modeling. For example, of how can we better the existing climate models. But this is to say that climate models can tell us a lot about what's going to happen a month from now, or 20 years from now. How do you use that information in such a way that it can actually benefit your new infrastructure design, for example, for parts of New Delhi, or how do you kind of design a new irrigation system? So these are seemingly simple things, which often get kind of lost in this transom of development. Science, technology, engineering kind of don't quite come together well. So that's what we're hoping to do.
Great. So one thing which has been often talked about, and in fact it perturbs me to the extent that I often think as to what is the alternative to this whole international negotiations,
Yeah.
because there was a lot of hope and much hype about uh, bringing together countries to achieve global consensus, which seems next to impossible. It's been over a decade since we've been trying to have COP meetings and try to get countries together. Countries which ratified initially in the Kyoto Protocol framework pulled themselves out later. So that doesn't look very hopeful. Is there any alternative to global consensus, as in probably the next best thing after global consensus, that will help us achieve the results faster?
I think now there. I think short answer would be, I think yes. There is. We cannot give up on global consensus. We cannot give up on multilateral negotiations.
Right.
It cannot just be bilateral. It cannot be country A dealing with country B, A dealing with C, A dealing with D, because then what you kind of lose is the ability to kind of enforce
Right.
these kind of bilaterals across different countries.
Right.
So multilateral negotiations are important, but maybe you need to kind of bring in science, because now that there is absolutely no doubt among scientists about the gravity of the situation. For
Yes.
example, your example is climate change.
Right.
It is not that scientists somehow are divided, that you have maybe 80% of the scientists feel that climate change is really, really a difficult challenge, and then 20% feel no, scientifically we still have ways to go. That's absolutely not the case.
Right.
It's almost, I would think, like 99% of the scientists are extremely concerned, and they are fully aware of the gravity of the situation. But because of political economy reasons,
Right.
because of reasons of how to kind of maintain the status quo
Right.
when it suits you,
Yeah.
when it suits your company, suits
Yeah.
your country,
Country.
that's what is kind of getting in the way.
Right.
Because countries are reflections of the dominant interests of
Right.
people.
Right.
It's not the reflection of all of the people. There is
Right.
also a thing as a reflection of all of the people, even in the best of democracies.
Right.
It is, what happens is it's a reflection of the majority. And in some areas, some countries, and for some situations, it could be, in fact, be a reflection of a minority of the people,
Right.
but who have dominant interest.
Yeah.
Okay, and so status quo for many of such concerns is preferable to dramatic change, because in change you never know what's going to happen. There will be a new set of losers and winners.
Right.
So what we're now kind of fighting, and we cannot give up the fight.
Right.
What we're fighting is this ability to kind of really show the kind of not just the world governments,
Mhm.
but the citizens
Right.
of the world of how difficult the situation is, and you
Right.
just cannot kind of go on, cannot ignore climate change,
Yeah.
and that would be at the peril of everyone.
Yeah.
But again, the issue is political economy comes in that, for example, the wealthy in India or the wealthy in Malaysia or the wealthy in Europe can certainly look after themselves, even in a climatically harsh world. Of course, it's not going to be business as usual. They'll have to give up a lot,
Yeah.
but they can still. So the people who are going to be impacted are not just the poor and marginalized, but increasingly the low income and the middle income. So you really need to get this message across.
Yeah.
So the media has a huge role to play. That it's not just somehow the problem of the elites or the problem of the industrialized countries, or it's not that the problem of India, but it's not now, 30 years from now. The problem is that a lot of speakers here have spoken about the issues of even with marginal sea level rise, the impacts on coastal erosion and the impacts on livelihoods. Now you have monsoonal variations that are not following kind of historic patterns, with kind of huge impacts on agriculture, hydropower. So these are the issues that media needs to kind of pick up
Yeah.
and kind of really project as, is this the future we want?
Yeah.
Whose future is this?
Right.
What can we do about the future?
Right.
Because then we don't really need that kind of mobilization. Then we don't really need any kind of special mobilizations.
Right. I understand. Right. So yesterday, somebody from the University College London put across a question. In fact, he happens to be a researcher in science.
Okay.
And said that there seems to be a significant gap between the scientific community and the business community or the policymakers. which means that every technological innovation or development is not able to translate itself into immediate implementation at the ground level. By that I mean implementation at any level for that matter. Businesses do not incorporate it, and there exists to be a significant gap. Do you think that there does exist a gap, or is it just some group's notion, or it's notional, which does not have much basis to it?
Calling it a gap, you somehow, that's a more kind of passive explanation, that there is a gap. The question would be, if there is a gap, why is there a gap?
Right.
It's not for lack of literacy on science. Is there a gap because it suits these companies to believe that in your, for example, in your the example you gave, that climate change doesn't exist, or is it something more? So is it scientific literacy the problem, or is it a problem of political economy? If governments don't want to follow what their own scientists say because it doesn't suit their dominant interests, so I would actually push the researcher a little bit further, saying, okay, why do you think there is a gap? Is it just a gap that exists in a normative sense because that's the way maybe epistemological, that there is a gap because there's always been a gap? But I think it is because of certain kind of interests and the way interests are kind of executed in mediating between science, technological development, and applications. That's what at every one of these stages, that we have these interests that are stymieing, that are trying to stop or trying to put a brake, then of course you have a gap.
Yeah.
But it's not a gap in the passive
Sense.
sense.
Yeah. Got it.
It's not like life exists, gap exists.
Yeah.
It's not in that sense.
Right. Dr. Someshwar, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.